It's a great honor to be here today, and for this opportunity, I prepared a paper that got much longer than I expected, and it's some 30 pages long, and I don't have time to cover it all, but if you can give me your email address at the end of the speech, I will, as soon as I get back to Denver, I'll give you a copy of it. Tim mentioned my latest book, Managing Risk and Complexity Through Open Communication and Teamwork. I will refer to it several times during my talk, but I think that I ought to begin with a description of a few biographical facts so that you know what my interests are today in talking to you, financial and other kinds of interests. I got a PhD from Purdue University in 1962. My advisor was W. Charles Redding, and I've often referred to him, as many others have, as the founder of organizational communication. Professor Redding imbued in me, made sure that I and the other the first cohort of graduate students in this new field believed in the Redding ethic and lived by it. And the Redding ethic I have with me today internally is that in our teaching and our research, we must avoid a pro-management bias. Must avoid that bias. We must consider the interests of workers, suppliers, customers, owners, managers, and society. And in fact, I did my dissertation on an international labor union. And the most interesting idea that I came up with it is the idea of semantic information distance between the levels of a hierarchy. And those apply to any organization, not just a labor union. And I'll refer to it again. Now, in preparation for this meeting today, I read this book, Theorizing Crisis Communication, by two people you may know, Selnow and Seeger. And I must tell you that I was quite favorably impressed by it. And I was absolutely delighted to see a reference to my oldest and dearest friend in their book, the late Will Lenkugel, an article that he wrote with Mr. Ware on apologia. I mentioned that fact to his widow recently, and she was delighted to hear it. Now, in reading that book, though, I discovered that I think we have some differences in my approach and their approach. And we may have some semantic information distance between us, and so I might explore some of those today and take you back to 1967. Actually, the phone call came in '66, 4 years after I got my PhD. I got a phone call from a man with a slight German accent asking me if I wanted to spend a summer as a summer faculty consultant at the Marshall Space Flight Center of NASA. I later found out that I was the first soft scientist ever to be invited to such a position. And I said to the person, "Isn't that where you are making the mighty Saturn V, the rocket to go to the moon?" And he said, "Yeah, yes, we are." And I said, isn't that also where the director of the Marshall Center is the legendary Dr. Werner von Braun? And he said, yes. And that was my job, was to work for von Braun, who is undoubtedly the most brilliant rocket scientist of all time. And when I went to work with him, I found out that he had discovered in his own organizational experience, and listen to me carefully, don't bite, that communication is the best way to understand and manage complex organizations. He discovered that on his own. And that's why I was there to try to find problems of communication in the system. Because what I talked about as problems in communication, he regarded as risks to the Apollo project. You understand? Yeah. Okay, my job was to, in that short summer, after my orientation period, in which I observed a rocket test that bent trees over with the force of it. But a strict orientation program, my job then was to interview in depth. No questionnaires, please. They had been answering questionnaires and thought it limited their answers so much. In-depth interviews, it will take. Sometimes I had to go back 2 and 3 times. But I was to interview the top 55 people in that organization. And I was supposed to find out problems. They were supposed to tell me problems. And what they told me was not traceable in any way. I came up with the problems, but I also I happened to ask, what works? And they said, they told me about them. And they were the most brilliant collection of communication practices I have ever discovered. And nothing to equal it. Let me give you just a couple of concepts at work. First of all, 7,200 employees, most of them technical engineers, rocket scientists, and so on. The concept of automatic responsibility. How does that work? Suppose you're in laboratory A and there's some component that's assigned to laboratory D, but if in the course of your work you find a problem, the moment you perceive it, you assume responsibility. You own it. And you also own the responsibility for communicating it up the line, because if it's too complex for you as an individual or a lab, von Braun would put together disparate employees. They would go to work and no one could overturn their decision. Participatory decision making. Automatic responsibility. Second, von Braun in his first interview with me, first conversation, said to me with his capacity for brilliant analogies, this is like being in the earthquake prediction business. And I have to put my sensors out where they are needed. Sensors, where did they have to go? 7,200 people in the Marshall Space Flight Center, but 200,000 people working on the Saturn V, in contractors and so on. He said, yes, I have my sensors even in those organizations. And there were times when they came to Huntsville, Alabama with a stage of the rocket, and we knew more about it than they did. That's called penetration. Von Braun was once invited to testify before Congress why contractors did such better work for his organization than others, and he said, by penetration. We penetrate the organizations and know what they are doing. Monday notes. I wish I had time to explain this. This is so brilliant. Carl Weick read my description of it and said, this is the secret of the learning organization. 24 people every Monday morning wrote a one-page note to the boss, and that was, he wrote in the margins, reproduced them, sent them back to the original 24 people, and they jumped 2 levels in the hierarchy. Well, these are just some of the brilliant communication practices that he developed, and it worked. In case you didn't hear, we did meet Kennedy's promise to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely within the decade. 69. We got it done a year earlier, and partly because I was there in 67 and 68. No. Well, I worked, I let a little time elapse, and then I wrote a couple of articles for communication monographs, but I'm still dealing with, not with risks, but with communication problems. And then I was forced to think about otherwise when the Natural Hazards Research Center at the University of California at Boulder had read my NASA research and invited me to make a presentation, the only soft scientist again, at a colloquium sponsored by the National Science Foundation. They were into natural hazards, but the dividing line between natural hazards and human-made crises was disappearing. They wanted to get into crisis, so they asked me to make a presentation, Risk and Crisis. So, what did I do? I didn't want to go over the same material again, so I had heard about the Aviation Safety Reporting System. And a great deal was said about it, but nobody had ever studied it. I said, that's my project. My NASA papers got me in. How did it work? If anybody working in the aviation industry, saw a risk at an airport, an airplane, pilots, whatever, you filed a NASA report, and it went to this third party, objective third party. They tore off your name and address, mailing it back to you, giving you immunity and anonymity. Report anything you want. I thought, this sounds good. I've got to go check on that. Well, I did. Went to Mountain View, California. I met the computer, and the people who put the data in the computer were former air traffic controllers and pilots and so on, and they let me ask a few questions. And I said, how many of these 70,000 reports that have come in now? And if they were scary reports, they would broadcast to everyone in the aviation industry what a tree that's overgrown in front of a runway, to give a dumb example. But they would, 70,000 of them. And I said, how many of them have to do with communication? Communication was not in the computer's vocabulary, but information transfer was. So we asked that, and guess what? They were stunned. 70% of the reports were communication problems. 70% of the 70,000 reports, risk reports, were about communication. An example would be the air traffic controller who says runway B, and the pilot hears runway D, and you try to come in on the wrong runway. They were amazed. I gave my report to the NSF colloquium. They were amazed. They couldn't believe it, but they did finally believe it. And someone released my paper, my technical paper, to the press without telling me about it, and I had more than 15 minutes of fame. I was on a radio talk show in New York City for an hour or two. I was on a radio talk show in Chicago, and a pilot on the way to O'Hare stopped to call in and said, he's absolutely right. These things do happen, and the aviation safety reporting system, the principles are wonderful, and so on, so on. I was interviewed in Denver, Channel 9, Mr. Shapiro. I watched it on TV. CNN picked it up. It went all over the world. I heard from colleagues in Australia. 70% of risky messages have to do with communication. My conclusion from all of that was that one of the biggest, are you listening? One of the biggest risks to organizations is communication. My new subtitle for the paper today, the presentation today, is Communication as Both Bane and Antidote. Both bane and antidote. And now if we could have figure 1. In 1968, I went back to Marshall Space Flight Center, and I interviewed a brilliant engineer in one of the laboratories, and his name was, that's figure 2. I need figure 1, please. Thank you. And his name was Hans Paul. And he sat down and we talked, and he drew this diagram for me. And it has never been published until in my book. I published it for the first time. And I want to give him credit for it, of course. He just drew it for me and said, this is Paul's law. The vertical line is the amount or energy or effort to diagnose and correct problems. The horizontal line is time over time. Does this make sense? If you want a really terrible example, think of cancer. Is it easy to diagnose in the early stages? No, not so easy. And a whole lot of effort has to be exerted to do that. Is it easy to diagnose over time? Yes, it gets much easier. Is it? How is it to take care of it then? Well, to correct it, it goes up. Does this make sense to you? Paul's Law, published for the first time in my book, and with credit to Hans Paul for drawing it for me that day. Perhaps we could flip now to figure 2. And with a certain lack of modesty, I call this one the Paul Tompkins Law of risk and communication. And I hope you can see it. I hope it makes sense to you. The vertical is still energy or work that's necessary, and the horizontal dimension is time spent, and it works the same way. And I think von Braun would have approved of this, because I'm going to make Paul's Law even more complicated and have you think of this as 1/2 of an organization chart, an organization diagram. Can you do that? The vertical line is the hierarchy, and this is the base of the lower line is the base of the organization. Now, what does this tell you about organizational communication? I think what it tells you is what von Braun knew, and that was get as many channels of communication up as you can in a risky business. Redundant channels of communication. He had the Monday notes, he had the regular reporting, he had the briefings, he had group meetings, and so on. To increase the redundant channels of communication going up. Make sense? Catch the problems, the technical problems early. Okay. I've got a coincidence to tell you about now. After I accepted the invitation to give this speech today, I heard from a publishing company. And the publishing company is Routledge. You've heard of them? And they said, we've acquired rights to a book that you and Elaine Anderson wrote 45 years ago, and we're going to publish a new edition. And I said, why? 45 years? When it was first published, it was a British publishing company. They immediately went out of business, and so did the book. No one could ever find it, and so on. So I said, why are you doing it now? And they said, because we think every library in the world should have a copy of it. And so it recently arrived. Here it is. Can you see it? Communication Crisis at Kent State, a Case Study. Did you hear the alliteration in there? What Kenneth Burke calls concealed alliteration? Communication Crisis at Kent State, a Case Study, Philip K. Tompkins and Elaine Anderson. Make sure your library has it. It's one of the biggest studies I think I've ever heard of in our field. We did almost 500 interviews. It was well known at the university at Kent State that I had worked for NASA working on risky propositions, and they asked me to serve on a commission. They gave me a grant to study this, and Elaine Anderson and I did almost 500 interviews. Students, faculty, administration, and so on. Yeah. I'm thinking now.
Where else but ICRC can you have someone get up in Philip Tompkins' business to raise a microphone? That's the type of intimacy we have here at this conference.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Yeah. While teaching, I was still teaching, of course, and a student came up to me in my undergraduate communication theory class and said, Phil, could I give you a term paper without any words? And I said, John, I've never had one. How could you do that? And he said, well, I was on campus when it happened, and I had my camera. And I think I can give you a paper. The order of the photographs will tell a story about communication. And so he did. And he gave us permission to put it in the book, and I see that in the reproduced version, his term paper is reproduced. And you may recognize this one of the more famous photographs in the term paper. Yeah. His hometown newspaper nominated it for an award, and John Philo's term paper for my class won the Pulitzer Prize for photography in 1971. And it's in this new copy of it, and I think you might, because I suspect that one reason the publishing company may have done it is the fear of terrorist acts on university campuses. And there are some things you can learn in here. My God, what did we find when we did all of these? I personally interviewed all of the administrators, and I discovered that the president of the university was out of town that weekend. Despite all of the events leading up to Monday, May 4th, the president decided to leave campus over the weekend, and he did not tell any of his fellow administrators that he would be gone. Do you understand the implications of this? You've had the governor of Ohio calling out the National Guard. You have the commander of the National Guard. You have the mayor of Kent, Ohio, all who needed to talk. That's why we called it communication crisis at Kent State. It was communication that should have happened that didn't. It was failed communication. Yeah. So I think we've got a new category of crisis. Risks and crisis. Call it inter-organizational. We had horizontal and vertical and horizontal problems, and we also had the inter-organizational crisis. And since then, I have thought of 3 others that I can mention for you today, and perhaps it's a category that I could not find in Sellnow and Seeger. What are the other examples? Well, when the space shuttle Challenger, we had that tragedy. I got called into action, had to go back to NASA, interview people, wrote a book about it, and what did I find? They had forgotten those brilliant practices that we had developed during the Apollo program. Von Braun and the others in his organization had been forced to retire. They had forgotten everything, and they reversed one of the most important commandments. They violated it and reversed it. Our job was to make the contractors prove the vehicles would fly. And on the eve of the launch of Challenger, the contractor didn't want to fly because of the cold temperature, and they had never used the missiles, the rocket engines at that temperature. Some of the NASA officials asked them to prove it would not fly. Yeah. Well, that's one of them. And same thing with Columbia, pardon me. And then a new situation arose fairly recently. And that was last August when I had a book signing at the Tattered Cover bookstore in downtown Denver, Colorado. We had a large crowd there, and believe it or not, Managing Risk and Complexity was a business bestseller for a couple of weeks in Denver, Colorado. But at the end of the speech, 4 men came up all together, each in line together, and 4 of them bought 7 copies of the book and said, "We want to talk to you later." And later I did talk to them, and they were officers from fire department, suburban fire departments in Denver. And I met with them the first time over a cup of coffee, and they were quoting my book to me and said, "We're going to need a second edition of this book. We're going to need a chapter about us, our fire department, and the problems." Well, let me mention Battalion Chief Mike Stanley, who is an important figure in this so far, and Ryan Field, Coordinator of Emergency Management. I've been meeting with them, and they want me to help implement the recommendations of my new book in the Aurora, Colorado Fire Department, 3rd largest city in Colorado. Why? Why do they want the open communication and teamwork, participatory decision-making, and so on? Do you remember the Aurora Theater incident? Those of you in crisis communication, you remember it? a man named James Holmes, killed 12 people, wounded 70 others. And in Colorado, the paramedics travel with the fire department. They gave me a report of what happened after that, and the formal report. And Matt Seeger, here's another, your official report. It said that the fire department and the police department did not cooperate effectively during the crisis. And I asked them, what is this all about? Well, as I said, the paramedics are with the fire engine. They ride with them. Police department separate. But when they are called together to the same places, the police get there first and double park in front of the place of the incident. And when the fire engine gets there, the best place for it to be, it can't be parked. And then, more importantly, the police have a militaristic command structure. They give orders, they do not listen, and so on. The fire department wants to try to get them, when we arrive together at the same incident, to say, I'm Phil, you're Mike, and so on and so forth. Just like the cockpit preparation discussion in an airplane. The crew gets together, shake hands, introduced by first name, and so on. That's what they want to do. And of course, a great deal more. And in the paper that I wrote for this occasion, Mike Ryan, I asked him, Mike, when does a risk become a crisis? And he gave me a definition that is included in that paper. Ryan Field wrote a master's thesis at the Naval Graduate Center that is strictly academic, very well written. And my wife and I, the other Dr. Tompkins, whose name was Elaine Anderson. Did I tell you that we decided to get married just after we published this book? We did, and the student who wrote the nonverbal paper, as a wedding gift, he traveled to Elaine's hometown, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we had an outdoor wedding, and his wedding present to us with photographs of it by a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. My bride is here today, and if you'd please wave your hand, stand up, please. There. Well, there's much more in the paper for your consideration, but I want to remind you, though, of the importance of communication as being the problem, as being the risk, and that we have got to encourage risky organizations to develop upward communication channel redundancy, more than one way up. The more, the better. And as I heard earlier in one of the programs in this room, organizational communication has tended to emphasize the internal processes, and PR has tended to emphasize the external, trying to present the organization in the best light. And I think we need to work together to integrate our work better so that we can know the total dynamics of the internal and the external, internal, and the external. In my book, in writing my recent book, I discovered that one ways of handling risks and avoiding crises is made by people who are brilliant in analogical thinking. I want you to read the chapter on medical risks and crises, because an important figure in there is Atul Gawande, an MD and a professor of medicine at Harvard and a regular writer for the New Yorker magazine, which is the first way I found out about him. And he found an analogy between the checklist on airplane flights, where the crew gets together, as I said, shake hands and so on, and now we've got a checklist to go through together. He thought, surgery is becoming so complicated I almost can't do it anymore. What if we had a checklist? He did a checklist, and then, as I report in the book, in 10 countries in the world, he got data on surgeries in their hospitals. Africa, India, Great Britain, United States, and so on and so forth. Guess what happened? After they got statistics before and after the training and the checklist, and the number of fatalities worldwide went down significantly. Well, Gawande saw another analogy that I think is worth mentioning today, and he said that good engineers learn to develop redundant parts. They build in backup systems within the larger system, right? Yeah, oh, I learned that by NASA. I didn't have to learn that from a Harvard surgeon. But then he went on to say that what they were doing was an imitation of the human body. Sit there and think for a minute how many things you have two of. Two of. Yeah. Most of us have 2 ears, 2 kidneys, 2 breasts, and some other parts. And how about eyes? Most of us have 2 eyes, except for the man standing before you. I was born with a condition called amblyopia, in which one eye did not develop. I don't think you can guess which one it is, but it did not develop. And so I have been all of my life a one-eyed man, a cyclops. And you remember in the Odyssey, remember, the Cyclops had to be defensive because Odysseus finally did stab him. All my life I've been like a Cyclops, defending my good left eye. Well, on February 24th of this year, less than 2 weeks ago, I signed a risk document, 2 pages long, of all the terrible things that could happen to me if I underwent surgery. I signed it. And that gave a surgeon permission to take the lens out of my good eye and replace it with an artificial one. The risk was becoming completely blind. But while trying to pack up for this trip, I thought, I'd better take with me down in Florida, it's almost as sunny as Colorado, I'd better take some of those clip-on sunglasses and put them on my... And I don't wear glasses anymore. And in fact, they think now, that when I get back to Denver, the surgeon thinks he can fix this other eye that has never worked and I may have redundant eyes. And I may be able to see two perspectives at the same time for the first time in my life, and I'm not sure I can handle it. But if I can, I promise to come back and tell you.
Dr. Donovan, thank you so much. You see with one eye more clearly than a lot of us with 4 eyes. So, we have just a couple of quick moments of questions, but I just wanted to point out one thing that I thought was very interesting. Is we often joke about going into communication because it's not rocket science, but apparently rocket science for some of the communication practices.
Yeah. Now, is that a question?
If you want it to be, yes.
Yeah. I think communication is more complicated than rocket science. And I think von Braun, do you know how smart von Braun was? You know, he was from Germany. You know, when he was 22 years old, he had 2 engineering degrees, a PhD in physics, and his dissertation was about explosions. He had, what else did he have? He spoke 3 languages. He had a pilot's license. He played the cello and the piano and wrote compositions for them at the age of 22. And the guy knew, by experience, could understand communication and see the analogies that I've sent are so important. Yeah, this is like being in the earthquake prediction business and so on. And, I think that communication is both the bane and the antidote, ironically. And I hope you see the irony. Communication can be misunderstood in 70% of the risk cases being reported in the first 70,000. Is that a pretty good sample? 70,000? Not bad, yeah. 70% of them. And one example I will give you. Here's a vice president of a commuting airline on the East Coast, and everyone knew he had the reputation of not talking while he was flying. So they were coming in for a landing, and someone said, "Sir, I think we're a little bit low coming in." No answer, and they hit the ground short of the runway, crashed the plane. He'd had a heart attack. And they didn't know it because he was not used to talking to them about any of the things. Well, I could go on and on about those things, but I hope you're sensitized now to the importance that it's the thing that solves the problem, but it also creates the problem in the first place when we misunderstand. Yeah, okay.
We have a quick question back here.
Hello, I'm from School of Communication, Florida State University. I have a question regarding organizational communication.
Yes.
You talked about your experience in the user organization. So, do you see any difference between crisis communication practices in risky organizations as compared to not so risky organizations? There should be a difference between how you do the strategies where the crisis occurs in a risky organization, because if there is a risk or a crisis that occurs in a risky organization, just like National Weather Center kind of action or the nuclear energy organization, then the impact of that crisis would be on the whole community. But if for other organizations, maybe the impact of that crisis is not that much in a scope. So how would you differentiate between the crisis communication strategies among those organizations?
Well, I don't mean to embarrass you, but I think this is an example of what I've been talking about, because I really don't know what you're asking. I don't understand.
Differences in strategies and approaches in organizations that have higher risk in their communication practices and strategies versus those that have lower risk.
Yes. Well, I think that the Marshall Space Flight Center probably had the riskiest job that I could think of to make that thing big enough to take the astronauts up. I am not asking every organization to do all of the things that we did in NASA, but maybe it would be good for all organizations and for a democracy if we practiced automatic responsibility. That if you saw a serious problem happening that could threaten your organization, that you buy it. You're responsible. And that you need to communicate it up the line because, well, so that others can do it. No, I think, but in any organization, I think the need for redundant channels of communication, that's important. I think it is. Yeah. I haven't thought about that, but yeah, I recognize differences, but I still would want to sensitize people to the fact that communication may itself be creating a risk. Yeah.
Dr. Tompkins,